Hello and welcome to the 7 o'clock evening news. I'm John Shelton. We begin with the main headlines. Kuwait announces accepting the United Nations invitation to host the third international aid pledging conference for Syria. The US military will deploy 400 trainers and hundreds more troops in a train and equip mission for Syrian rebel forces. Japanese Prime Minister pledges $2.5 billion in non-military assistance to the Middle East. And Ghana's president and other African leaders will discuss a specific plan of action for tackling and dealing permanently with Boko Haram militants. After the two successful Sierra pledging conferences that Kuwait hosted in 2013 and 2014, it was announced that Kuwait is considering hosting a third conference for Syria with the aim of alleviating the suffering of the Syrians inside and outside their country. Heber Abdul Rahman has more in the following report.
Kuwait's permanent delegate to the UN, Ambassador Mansour Al-Ataibi, announced today that Kuwait's delegation to the UN started consultation with the UN General Secretariat to set a date for the third International Aid Pledging Conference for Syria. Al-Ataibi said that the delegation is contacting and coordinating with the UN General Secretariat to agree on the arrangements and organizing matters to ensure the success of the coming aid pledging conference. Earlier, Kuwait officially announced plans to host a third International Aid Pledging Conference for Syria to raise money in order to alleviate the suffering of millions of Syrians who were displaced by the civil conflict in their country. Ambassador Al-Ataibi added that he has handed over the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon a letter from His Highness the Emir Sheikh Sabah Al-Ahmed Al-Jaber Al-Sabah, including His Highness the Emir's agreement on Kuwait's hosting of the third International Aid Pledging Conference for Syria. Last 2 years, Kuwait hosted the first and second aid pledging conferences for Syria in 2013 and 2014. The two conferences were successful and raised $3.9 billion in aid pledges, $1.5 billion in the first conference, and $2.4 billion in the second one. Kuwait donated a total of $800 million in the two conferences, as $300 million in the first one and $500 in the second. The pledged money is used to help the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, and other aid organizations respond to the massive humanitarian needs generated by the crisis in Syria. The UN's humanitarian agencies provided life-saving food supplies, water, shelter, medicines, health services, and supporting livelihoods to the internally and externally displaced Syrians.
The US military will deploy 400 trainers and hundreds more troops in a train and equip mission for Syrian rebel forces. The American troops will be deployed starting in early spring on 6 to 8 week missions in 3 countries, Turkey, Qatar and Saudi Arabia, as part of the Obama administration's plan to expand training for moderate Syrian rebels. Those groups are battling forces loyal to Syrian President Bashar al-Assad and extremist groups such as the so-called Islamic State or IS, as well as others linked to Al-Qaeda. The latest announcement comes days after senior US officials met Syrian opposition leaders in Istanbul, Turkey. The US hopes that by training the rebels, they will be more effective in the fight against IS militants. Meanwhile, in Yemen, gunmen kidnapped Yemeni President Abd Rabbu Mansour Hadi's chief of staff in Sana'a today. Mubarak was reportedly seized near a checkpoint in Hada, the southern district in Sana'a, while on his way to a ceremony related to the issuance of the new draft constitution. The draft is a result of a national dialogue aimed at easing a transition of power following mass street protests that led former President Ali Abdullah Saleh to step down in 2012. No group has yet claimed responsibility for the kidnapping. The Yemeni presidency is also yet to comment. Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has pledged $2.5 billion in non-military assistance to the Middle East. Abe was speaking in Egypt at the start of his 6-day tour of the region, which includes Jordan, Lebanon, Israel and the Palestinian territories. He met with Egyptian government officials and businessmen in Cairo. He pledged $200 million in non-military aid for countries fighting the so-called Islamic State, saying the world would suffer if terrorism spread. He said that Japan would provide infrastructure and humanitarian assistance to the region, including support for countries hosting refugees from Iraq and Syria. In a rare protest in the Algerian capital Algiers, thousands of people marched to demonstrate against the French satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo. Protesters gathered in the centre of Algiers and chanted slogans like "Against the satirical magazine's journalist and its policy." Later, some broke through police barriers and surged toward the Parliament building, prompting volleys of tear gas by police and running street battles. Police eventually dispersed the demonstrators by using snowplows and tear gas. The demonstration was unusual for Algiers, where protests have been banned since 2001. Libyan factions vying for control of the country have agreed to continue United Nations-backed talks in Geneva next week over ending the political crisis, although one main group has so far refused to participate. Nearly 4 years after a NATO-backed revolt ousted Muammar Gaddafi, Libya is in turmoil, with two rival governments and two parliaments backed by armed factions, who Western governments fear may drag the country into civil war. Key representatives from a self-declared government based in Tripoli stayed away from this week's talks, but in a possible sign of progress, its main armed groups battling forces of the internationally recognised government declared a ceasefire. That government, under Prime Minister Abdullah al-Thani and the elected House of Representatives, have operated out of the east after one faction, Libya Dawn, took over Tripoli in the summer, set up its own government and reinstated the old parliament known as the GNC. Representatives for Britain and the United States joined negotiating partners for another round of nuclear talks with Iran, as both US President Barack Obama and British Prime Minister David Cameron urged Congress to avoid ordering new economic sanctions on Iran, arguing that doing so could upend the delicate diplomacy. During a joint press conference with Cameron, Obama warned Congress that if it passed further sanctions against Iran, he would veto them. Obama said that new US penalties on Iran would give Tehran an excuse to walk away from talks and to blame Washington for the failure, weakening support for the existing sanctions. Negotiators have set a March deadline for reaching a framework that would address the international concerns about Iran's nuclear program. Ghana's President John Mahama has said that he and other African leaders will discuss plans next week to deal permanently with Boko Haram militants. He said that he wanted African Union, the AU countries, to produce a specific plan of action for tackling the Nigerian-based group collectively, adding that this matter has to reach its end. Boko Haram has seized control of many towns and villages in northeast Nigeria in a 6-year insurgency. It has also begun threatening Nigeria's neighbours and earlier this week launched a raid on a military base in northern Cameroon. President Barack Obama and UK Prime Minister David Cameron announced yesterday efforts to diminish hacking threats, including the creation of a joint cybersecurity unit between intelligence and law enforcement agencies. Cameron also proposed US-based companies such as Facebook Incorporated and Google Incorporated to do more to stop terrorists from communicating in secret. He wants intelligence services and police to have the right to access encrypted message services such as Snapchat and WhatsApp, in addition to action to stop extremists. Both governments are moving to protect against breaches by hackers. The new cybersecurity unit will enable greater cooperation and information sharing between the US National Security Agency and UK Government Communications Headquarters. Troops have been deployed across Belgium to guard potential targets of terrorist attacks following a series of anti-terror raids and arrests. This comes as Europe is on high alert as more than 20 suspected militants have been arrested in Belgium, France and Germany following anti-terror raids. Security has been tightened in several countries after last week's attacks in Paris left 17 people dead. More details in the following report by Dina Nasser.
As European investigators moved on a broad front to sweep up suspected radicals, Belgian authorities charged 5 people with participating in the activities of a terrorist group following a series of raids that began on Thursday evening and left 2 suspects dead. Guns, munitions and explosives, as well as police uniforms and a large amount of money, were all seized by police overnight. On Thursday, the Belgian police launched an operation to dismantle a terrorist cell and the logistics network behind it. They moved in on a hideout used by the suspected extremists in the eastern city of Verviers, killing 2 suspects and wounding and arresting a 3rd. At a news conference in Brussels, a Belgian federal magistrate said that the police had arrested 13 people as the ongoing investigation showed their intention to kill several policemen in the street. No link has been established between the terrorist plot in Belgium and last week's attacks in Paris. However, French Prime Minister Manuel Valls said today that despite this, both countries face the same threats. France was still on high alert as police separately arrested 12 people overnight and questioned them about possible logistic support they may have given to the brothers Saad and Sharif Kouachi, who attacked the Charlie Hebdo offices in Paris, and Amadi Koulibaly, who took hostages at a kosher market shortly after shooting dead a policewoman. As some 120,000 police and soldiers have been mobilized across France, the police evacuated the Gare de l'Est train station after a bomb threat to prevent new violence. Elsewhere, the authorities said that 2 people have been freed earlier in the day and a gunman has been arrested a day after he took the hostages at the post office in the town of Colombes. Meanwhile, in Germany, the police arrested 2 Turkish men suspected of having links to an organization supporting the so-called Islamic State militants and other radical groups fighting in Syria. The tide of arrests came as politicians pledged to boost security in the face of what they said was a growing threat from terror cells. In a joint press conference following bilateral talks in Washington, US President Barack Obama and British Prime Minister David Cameron vowed to help defeat the threat of cross-border terrorism with better surveillance and stronger cooperation with France and across Europe. For his part, Belgian Prime Minister Charles Michel said he was ready to call up the army to ensure security in the wake of the raids, raising the country's terror alert to level 3 on a scale of 4.
Chinese authorities said today that 22 people died when a tugboat capsized while on a test voyage on the Yangtze River. 3 people were freed when rescuers cut through the bottom of the boat's hull early yesterday, 14 hours after it went down. Swift currents hampered the operation. Today, rescue teams were able to pull the vessel to the surface and to shallow waters for a thorough search inside. The newly built 30-metre long Wanshen Zhu 67 was on a test voyage on Thursday in the Yangtze River's Fubai Channel in Jiangsu province when it suddenly turned over. Thousands of demonstrators took to the streets across Brazil to protest against an increase of public transportation fares. Scuffles between police and demonstrators erupted in Sao Paulo. Meanwhile, in Rio de Janeiro, hundreds of demonstrators marched through the streets of the 2016 Summer Olympics host city. The fare hike, which went into effect last week, raises the public transport fare by 18% in Sao Paulo and 13% in Rio de Janeiro. In June 2013, protests against higher transportation fares mushroomed into demonstrations against corruption, poor public services, and the billions spent on last year's Football World Cup and the 2016 Olympics in Rio de Janeiro. In 2 weeks, Kuwait is set to witness 100 years since the opening of its first official post office, which was the home of the then British colonial administrator, currently known as Beit Dixon Cultural Centre. The centennial celebration, precisely on January 21st, was discussed in a forum on the history of postal services in Kuwait as part of Al Qurain Cultural Festival activities delivered by Chairman of the Kuwait Philatelic and Humanistic Society, Mohammed Abdul Hadi. Here is more on the event in this report by Salam Al-Kandari.
Kuwait National Library witnessed a forum on the launch of the postal services in Kuwait, which is now going to witness 100 years since its establishment. Informal postal services began in 1775, during which mail was carried in bags to Basra in Iraq and Syria, usually taking around 14 to 20 days to arrive.
Today there is a lecture about the history of postal services in Kuwait, and I am going to deliver the first part of it. I'm the chairman of Kuwait Philatelic Society, and I am going to talk about the history of postal, not postal really, mail history in the area, and later when we can divide it into two parts. The first part started in Kuwait in 1750, when the first recorded letter was sent from Kuwait to Aleppo in Syria. We received the goods that were sent from India to Europe, which used to be sent through Basra. It was diverted during the war between Persia and Ottoman Empire to Kuwait instead of Basra, and then from Kuwait it used to be carried by Camel Express.
It was only in 1915 that was the first official post office opened its doors, leading to the creation of the first stamp bearing the name of the country, yet also bearing the image of Britain's King George VII and the Indian currency, the rupee. The Kuwaiti government assumed responsibility of postal services within the country from the British in 1958, releasing their first stamps that same year, followed by its administration of exterior services a year later and Universal Postal Union membership the following year. It has been 100 years since the establishment of the postal services in Kuwait, and this forum was to document the development of the postal services. From Kuwait National Library, this is Salam Kandari reporting for the English News.
For a chance to see our reports again, please visit our YouTube channel at MOI Kuwait News. That's all the news for now, but you can join us again for the news brief at 11 p.m. Before we end, here is a quick reminder of today's headlines. Kuwait announces accepting the United Nations invitation to host the third International Aid Pledging Conference for Syria. The US military will deploy 400 trainers and hundreds more troops in a train and equip mission for Syrian rebel forces. Japanese Prime Minister pledges $2.5 billion in non-military assistance to the Middle East. And Ghana's president and other African leaders will discuss a specific plan of action for tackling and dealing permanently with Boko Haram militants.